Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending Suicide Prevention, a community training. I'm John Cummings. I'm the Deputy Director of Communications for the Mental Health Recovery Board serving Warren and Clinton counties. And I officially want to welcome you today to this training, the second of our two sessions to wrap up Mental Health Month. We really appreciate you taking the time to come on and learn some tips to get involved and help someone step away from thoughts of suicide or stop them from attempting suicide in the future, and we'll provide a little more in the way of resources for you there as we go along in this presentation. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. There will be a Q&A opportunity for everyone. It is available at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask questions as they come to mind. We'll just answer all of them together once we reach the end of the presentation. And we're also recording this webinar, so we can post it on our YouTube channel in just a few days so that other people might be able to take advantage of this training as well. So I want to turn it over now to Alex Rulon. He is with Talbert House and is an associate director with the organization there and has been doing trainings like this for, I guess, quite a while, Alex. So I will turn the baton over to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Again, my name is Alex Rulon. I'm an associate director at the Talbert House. I've been an associate director for 10 years. Specific to this training, I have overseen our suicide and crisis telephone hotline here in Hamilton County for the last 10 years. Our local suicide crisis telephone hotline here in Hamilton County that we oversee is 281-CARE, 281-CARE. We're also a partner of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We take calls locally as well as nationally through our partnership with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And I would just like to take a second before we launch into the training to thank everyone who is here with us to join the training. Suicide is obviously a very challenging and difficult topic to discuss. It can be, depending on your levels of comfortability and your expertises and your background, a very difficult subject to discuss and to talk about. So you guys being here and joining us today, in my mind, you guys are all genuinely and truly heroes. And while I only have about 45 minutes to an hour of your time, so my goal today is to do my best within that time frame to put tools in your tool belt to make you feel a little bit more confident and to give you a little more knowledge about suicide in general, how to confront a situation where someone you might be working with or living with or friends or family with who might be experiencing thoughts of suicide. So if you guys will wait for just 1 second, I'm going to share my screen with you so we can look at our PowerPoint together. And so I am a self-proclaimed nerd. I'm a numbers guy by nature. I love numbers. I love statistics. I love facts. This is what I call the suicide iceberg, if you will. Essentially, the meaning behind this is that there's so much more that goes into suicide than meets the eye. We often, hear about or hear the acronym or the saying about an iceberg. You see what's over top of the surface, but it's often much bigger. It's a much bigger problem. It has a more tremendous impact with what you don't see below the surface. So this is the most recent data that was released to us through the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Have to give them credit for the data and statistics here. This data is in our state of Ohio, and it was most recently collected and released in 2017. There you have Ohio's population of, just over 11.5 million people. We've had 1,685 reported suicides in the state of Ohio. Reported suicides, meaning that the situation was a confirmed situation. Someone had either left a note or, had contacted someone, or the circumstances in which the person's life ended was without doubt or without question. So we keep that number in mind. 1,685 individuals in Ohio in 2017 unfortunately passed away from suicide. And then we go down a little bit further under the surface, and we're talking about potentially another 5 to 25% more suicides from people who have passed away. So that 1,685 number, that's 3-year-old data, and we know that suicide in our community and in our country around the world is something that's only increasing. So in 2017, we're talking about 5 to 25% more suicides. And you might be asking yourself, what does unreported suicide mean? Well, there are plenty of situations where someone had intentions of taking their own life, but the circumstances or the situation might not be clear. I apologize if these examples hurt anyone's feelings or upset anyone, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, someone who might drive their car, off a bridge or into water, there's no way of knowing for sure whether or not that was a suicidal act or not, or just an accident on the road. You hear stories all the time of someone who was genuinely like working with or cleaning a firearm, and an accidental discharge then took their life. So on above the surface, we have the reported and known suicides, and slightly below the surface, we have what could be potentially a much higher number of reported suicides if we were to have known the reason behind the person's passing away. A little bit further down the iceberg, we're talking about suicidal behaviors now. These are behaviors that someone is taking in an effort to potentially go down the path, or we'll talk about this later in the presentation, the river of suicide, if you will. These are someone who is putting plans in place, or it could be in the area of incorrectly taking medication, or cutting, or putting themselves in extremely high risk, potentially life-taking situations in which their life wasn't taken. So again, starting at the top of the iceberg, you have someone you have over 1,600 reported suicides. That gets to 5 to 25% larger. And now you have 40 to 100 times greater numbers for people who exhibit or distribute suicidal behaviors. And then we get into the number of affected people who are actually affected by someone suiciding. The number can be very large. If it could be someone who has a tremendous impact in a community, or we so often hear about when tragically someone who's in the national spotlight or in the national media, or a celebrity happens to take their own life. And then there are situations where someone suicides, and the impact might be a little smaller, simply because they might just not have the national notoriety that somebody else may have. And then at the base of the iceberg, we're talking about over 500,000 people in the state of Ohio in 2017 stated that they had thoughts, were living with thoughts, previously had thoughts of suicide. So that is obviously a very impactful and big number, big picture wise. So again, thank you for taking the time to nerd out with me, if you will, and review some of the suicide numbers in our state from 2017. I am now going to transition slides to an exercise that we are going to be doing a few times together. So I apologize in advance if you find this exercise to be tedious or annoying. But in my experience with working at a suicide and crisis telephone hotline, one of the things that I noticed in working with people were my employees really had a difficult time directly asking the person that they were speaking with or working with, are they thinking about suicide? For some reason, because it is such a difficult topic, since it is such a difficult subject, we genuinely have a very difficult time asking the question. And when anytime you're working with someone who you think, or speaking with someone or interacting with someone who you think might be suicidal, there comes a point in the conversation where we have to just plainly and simply ask the question. We have to ask them the question, because just like anything in life, the old expression goes, if you want an answer, you got to ask a question. And if you ask the question in a different way, the person genuinely might not know what you're talking about, and they might not be as honest with you about what they're going through, about what they're experiencing, and what they're thinking. So more often than not, if we ask the question plainly, directly, and simply, are you thinking about suicide? That often can be a very freeing question for someone, and give them the pathway or the gateway to be able to discuss how they're feeling with the group. So I would like to take a second now where, I'll stop talking. And my request of everyone who is participating in this webinar is to say the question aloud: are you thinking about suicide? Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in exercise number 1. Again, this is going to be something we are going to do a few times throughout the course of the training today. And my goal, again, with this exercise is simply just making sure everyone is comfortable, or getting comfortable, or on the pathway to being comfortable with asking the question of someone: are they thinking about suicide? So moving forward, we are going to now talk about suicide symptoms and signs. We'll talk about 2 main factors. We'll talk about risk factors. A risk factor is something, is essentially like a characteristic or an incident or what may have you. It's a part of someone's life or of their being that puts them at a risk of being suicidal. And then another major factor within someone being potentially suicidal is them giving us warning signs. Those warning signs can be verbal, they can be nonverbal, they can be done in a multitude of different ways, but through the evaluation of both risk factors and someone's warning signs, we should be able to put an idea together whether or not they're potentially suicidal. And we want to evaluate that before asking the question. But I've always been a major proponent that asking the question isn't necessarily going to put that into someone's mind. It can simply be something that they can just as easily rule out. If they're not suicidal, if they're not thinking about suicide, and you ask the question, quote unquote, too early, they'll simply dismiss it. And you can go down the path towards getting them the help they need in an area that they actually need it, and not with suicide. So while we are going to discuss suicide risk factors and potential suicide warning signs, I want to plainly state that my list is not a comprehensive list, because essentially anything can be a sign or a symptom of suicide. And you might ask me, Alex, what does that mean? How can anything be a sign or a symptom? because it's really dependent on who the person is that you're working with or you're communicating with, living with, etc. You know, what are they typically like at their baseline? What are their normal typical behaviors? And then how are they currently acting? I often like to give an example of, if someone typically sleeps 3 to 4 hours a day, that might be concerning for some people, but for this person it might not be concerning. If suddenly they're sleeping 8 to 10 hours a day, you might think, well, that's a healthy, normal sleeping pattern. But for this person, it's not a healthy and normal sleeping pattern, because they typically function on 3 to 4 to 5 hours of sleep. So signs and symptoms of suicide can genuinely be anything, situation or person depending. But the ones that we'll talk about today are typically the most largely known, most largely accepted risk factors and warning signs of suicide. So risk factors, we talk about 3 different categories. The first category of risk factor would be someone's health. One of the main factors there is someone's mental health condition. Do they have a mental health condition? Do they potentially have a mental health condition that's not been diagnosed, that's not being treated? So you want to have conversations with people if you're noticing signs and symptoms of that. You know, be willing to take the walk with them. Be willing to make phone calls with them. Be willing to go to potentially intake appointments with them. Because obviously, you know, mental health is still, you know, doesn't have the stigma it did at one point, but it's still obviously very scary to people. And a lot of times you will see negative things occur from people who have gone undiagnosed as well as being diagnosed. Someone who may have a physical health condition can obviously be a major or a significant risk factor when it comes to someone's health, especially when you're speaking with or working with someone who's dealing with chronic pain. Chronic pain is something that obviously people deal with every day to varying levels. And obviously someone who's dealing with consistent and very real chronic pain could potentially be a very major risk factor to someone thinking about suicide. And obviously the final one in the health category is someone who suffers from some type of traumatic brain injury. Moving forward to the next risk factor area, that would be their environmental situation. Does the person who's potentially suicidal have access to legal means? Do they have firearms at their disposal? Do they have other types of lethal weapons at their disposal? Do they have drugs or, you know, over the counter or narcotic drugs at their disposal? Do they keep them on them? Do they keep them in the house? Do they have direct or immediate access to them? These are all the lethality means are something we'll talk about a little later in the portion today when we talk about suicide planning. But access to lethal means is obviously a main factor, a main risk factor for someone in the environmental area. Is the person dealing with a prolonged stress in their life, whether it be a relationship issue, a breakup with a girlfriend, a divorce? Are they suddenly unemployed or have been unemployed for a very long time? Is it someone who suffers from some type of bullying situation, whether it be an in-person bullying situation, or we're hearing and learning more about cyberbullying situations? Has the person experienced a significant stressful life event? Rejection. We talked a little bit about divorce, a major financial crisis, whether it's tied to unemployment or a life situation or extreme medical bills. Or is there another type of life transition going on, or a loss of a loved one, a family member, a friend, etc. And then the third and final category for risk factors is someone's history. It's like the old expression goes, those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. If you're working with or if you're talking with a family member or a friend, you might not have that historical data at your disposal. You might not truly know what their historical data is. More often than not, we're relying on them to self-report that information to us. Some people have a harder time discussing their history than other people do, but any type of tool that we can put in our belt to better understand the person and better understand the situation is very helpful to us when evaluating someone's risk factor. Do they have previous suicide attempts, whether they be, potentially lethal attempts or otherwise? Does the person have a family history of suicide? And do they have situations in their past that revolve around trauma, child abuse, and neglect? So that summarizes the three main areas of risk factors. We will now transition to suicide warning signs. The first warning sign that I want to discuss is the talk section. This is essentially what the people in our lives are saying to us, either verbally or potentially non-verbally. Is the person actively talking about killing themselves? I know it seems silly on the surface, but if someone is plainly having those conversations or actively talking about it, if they've gotten to the stage where they're actively discussing these types of things, it's obviously something that's very, very real to them and something that's in the front of their brain. When they're talking about killing themselves, at that point, they may already have a plan in place. They may have means in which to execute the plan. They might just be bringing it up as one final point of discussion to see if someone cares about them enough to have the conversation to try to talk them through it. Someone who expresses thoughts or emotions of feeling hopeless. Nothing ever works out for me. Nobody cares about me. Having or seeing no reasons for them to live. Why am I here? Why am I doing this? What is my purpose? Everything that I do never works out. Someone who feels like they're a burden to themselves or other people, those around them. You guys would be a lot better without me. All I do is cause you guys trouble and heartache and pain. Maybe it would just be easier if I wasn't here anymore. Another situation is someone who can feel trapped by a situation in life that they're in. Someone who may not see another way out in their mind. And what I like to tell people is whether or not that is the person's reality, those feelings are very real to them, and that is their reality. You might see a way out, or you may see another way, but ultimately how you and I feel about the situation might not appeal to that person, because we're all entitled to our own feelings. And if that person feels trapped and there's not another way out other than taking their lives, that's a path that they might travel. And then someone who is in an unbearable pain, whether that be a physical pain, emotional pain, or a psychological pain. Now moving forward to the behaviors that someone exhibits can also be a major warning sign. Someone who has no history of drug or alcohol use, are they now starting or beginning drug and alcohol use? That's obviously a major factor. Or someone who uses alcohol on an appropriate or subsistent level. Have they increased their alcohol use? Have they begun drug use? Have they taken what was a recreational drug use and now taken it to another level? Someone who might be looking for ways to end their life. Someone who never were interested in firearms or other lethal means. Are they now starting to accumulate those types of items? Someone who is beginning to withdraw from an activity that they were once very passionate about, whether it be a sport or family gatherings or a hobby that they're very passionate about. Have they suddenly begun to withdraw from those things that once gave them a great deal of joy and pleasure? Have they begun to isolate from family members and friends? That all of a sudden they don't text their friends back. They don't go to the birthday parties. They don't go to the football games, whatever may have you. Are they beginning to isolate from the people that at one point really made them happy? I know I mentioned this earlier, but evaluating someone's sleeping pattern can obviously be a major warning sign. It's very helpful though to know someone's baseline pattern, because on the surface, someone who's sleeping 8 to 10 hours a day, if they typically don't do that, that could obviously be a potential warning sign. Someone who suddenly changes their visiting habits. You may have a friend or a family member, a loved one who calls you, who texts you, who drops by every day, week, etc. Have they suddenly started to change that, or they're not coming over very often, or they're not coming over at all? Has someone begun to have conversations with us in a way that it's almost like they're trying to say goodbye to us? They're trying to make their peace with us and let us know that they care about us because they have ulterior plans or ulterior motives in their mind. Someone who's giving away a prized possession, and it may or may not make sense to us. Someone who is still capable of driving, and they've had this prized possession, old antique car, classic car, and suddenly they're giving it away without any warning or justification. And then someone who is suddenly and doesn't typically act in an aggressive fashion, whether it be physically or verbally, and someone who typically is higher motor. Are they showing fatigue? And now looking at the final warning sign is of the person's mood. Are they showing the following signs of depression, anxiety? Someone who either lives with tremendously high anxiety, and all of a sudden they show little to no anxiety. Don't be afraid to ask yourself or ask them those questions, because on the surface it might seem like, wow, they're doing much better with their anxiety. They're not nearly as anxious as they once were. We have to ask ourselves, why is that? Is it because they have a plan in place, and whatever was previously causing them the anxiety is no longer bothering them because they know they might not be with us any longer, or they know they're not going to have to deal with it for much longer? A sudden loss of interest, like we talked about, in activities, people, places, things, hobbies, a sudden or snap irritability in someone, someone who's faced a situation where they face tremendous shame or humiliation, whether it be in a public forum, a private forum, an online forum. Humiliation and shame is obviously something that can obviously trigger someone to then begin to think about suicide. And something I wanted to focus on for a second is, if someone shows tremendous relief or a sudden improvement, if you're living with someone or working with someone who consistently lives with a level of depression or anxiety or irritability, and all of a sudden it seems like one day they just flipped a switch, or they're no longer experiencing that or suffering from that or worried about that. Don't be afraid to ask yourself and then ask them the question, why the sudden improvement? We all want to see people improve. We all want to see them better themselves, but we have to ask the questions when a relief or an improvement has been so sudden. So don't be afraid to ask those questions, even when on the surface we see something to us that seems like an improvement. So I wanted to do our second exercise. Again, plainly asking the question can be very difficult. And my hope with doing these exercises is the more we ask the question, the more comfortable we'll become with plainly asking. So I'd like to take a second for everyone to ask aloud or to say aloud, are you thinking about suicide? Thank you everyone for participating. I really, really appreciate it. Um, I mentioned this slide a little earlier, and what this is called is the river of suicide. I'm sorry to everyone. I don't know if you guys are having issues seeing this slide or not. Essentially, the river of suicide is someone who eventually gets to a point of suiciding. It's very much a process, if you will. Typically, people don't wake up one day out of nowhere and commit suicide. It's a process that for different people can take months, can take years, can genuinely take a lot of time for them to get to the point where they're harming themselves. So if you look at up in the orange section, this is what we call the contributors section. This is the section where things happen in people's lives that can get them on the path to thinking about suicide. Things like, my girlfriend broke up with me. I got cut from the sports team. My friends don't want to hang out with me. I lost my job. My pet passed away. These are all different contributors into someone's life that can get them thinking about or get them on the path to suicide or get them flowing down the river of suicide, if you will. Between the orange section and the blue section, which is the water of the river, you'll see a barrier or a blockade there. And what that's meant to symbolize is most often when we're faced with contributing factors or unfortunate circumstances in our lives, there's something in us or around us that stops the flow of those contributors to keep it away from the river of suicide. We essentially move on to something else, and it takes our thoughts and our mindset away from suicide. The contributor section is what we call the prevention stage of suicide. This is where we can meet with someone at their level before they get to a point where they're actively thinking about suicide. This is the area where we ourselves can do things, or other people can do things for us to keep the negative thoughts kind of behind the barrier or the blockade, if you will. Unfortunately, there are times in our lives where that barrier or that blockade might have some holes or some cracks in it, and the thoughts don't get stopped there at the prevention stage, and they slowly leak into what we call the intervention stage. This is the stage where someone begins to have active thoughts about harming themselves. This is the stage where the suicidal behaviors start, putting their plan in place, gaining access to, lethal means, whether they be guns or knives or weapons or drugs or really starting to put their plan in place. And this is what we call the intervention stage. This is where someone, whether it be a loved one, a medical professional, a mental health professional, a counselor, a doctor, can intervene in someone's lives in an effort to perform what we call suicide first aid, And essentially that means putting a plan in place for someone, whether it be, case management or talk therapy or pharmacological management, putting things in place to try to get someone out of the river of suicide, if you will, and back to living their life and as close to their baseline as possible. And then down at the bottom of the river, you see the waterfall there. You see the rocks. This is unfortunately what we call the postvention area of the river. This is for help for people who have been impacted by someone who made the decision to commit suicide. This is the part of the river where that does unfortunately happen, where someone does take their own life. And postvention meaning, how do we get help for those people? How do we evaluate the situation that happened to do our best to make sure that it doesn't happen again? How do we make sure we get the people who were affected by this the help that they need, whether it be support groups, counseling, extra special or more attention from love and family members. So again, just to highlight again, the river of suicide, if you will, it typically starts up top in the contributors area. Hopefully, more often than not, the barrier or the blockade will keep those negative things that happen in our lives away from us beginning to think about suicide. But if it does, that's where the intervention stage takes place, where family, friends, loved ones, medical, mental health professionals can intervene to get someone off the path or out of the river of suicide. And then the final stage, unfortunately, if someone does commit suicide or take their own life, and making sure the people who are most impacted and who survive this incident get access to the services that they need. Moving forward to if you were by chance to be confronted with suicide, I like to tell people that when you're confronted with suicide, it's almost like coming to a fork in the road, if you will. You have to decide whether or not you feel comfortable going one way, which is to have a sense of comfortability or knowledge or experience or just passion about that person to be willing to have the conversation with them. And then the other path or avenue that we can take is you recognizing, I really don't feel comfortable talking about this, but I care enough about you to be able to get you access to someone, get you access to something, to make sure you have the ability to speak to someone who is comfortable talking about it. And please allow me to say that there is no right path for you to take when you're confronted with suicide. The most important part is that you're willing to give your time, to give your energy, to make sure that someone has the resources at hand to keep them safe for now. And I like to use the term safe for now because whenever you're confronted with a suicidal situation, your goal is to only keep that person safe in the immediate. You're never going to put a plan in place with someone that's going to keep them safe, quote unquote, forever, because there are other factors in our lives. People's thoughts and processes and situations change by the day, by the hour. So your goal whenever you're working with someone is to get them access to something that's going to keep them safe for right now, something that's going to keep them safe throughout the evening, throughout the day, to get them to another day, and then you reevaluate the situation then. So again, to recap, there are essentially two paths that we can take as caregivers when we are evaluating someone or working with or speaking with someone who is displaying signs of suicide. If we feel comfortable discussing suicide with the person, just a few things I like to tell people is do your best to make non-judgmental statements, to not criticize people for feeling the way that they're feeling, not to tell them necessarily that suicide is right or wrong. It's really not our job in that role to do that, because the person who is on that path or in that river of suicide makes some sense to them because they're actively thinking about it. So you potentially making a judgmental statement potentially could cause them to lock even further in their stance and be unwilling to further discuss the topic with you. They might be willing to discuss it with someone else, but they might not want to talk about it with you in that moment. So to do our best to actively listen, to be there, to be supportive, while doing our best to make non-judgmental statements when we're working with someone who is thinking about suicide. The next piece of advice I'd like to give is to avoid convincing statements of someone. So often you'll hear someone say, and it's great and wonderful advice in the sense that, I don't know why you're thinking about suicide. You've got a beautiful wife and got a beautiful family and you got everything figured out, and you shouldn't be doing this. Well, to that person who's living what they're living, suicide in some aspects might make sense to them. They might be going through something that is in the forefront of their brain that is obtaining or occupying the majority of their time, to the point where they're not going to be able to hear what you're saying from a convincing them standpoint of you got too much going for you, you have too much going on. So continuing to do our best to avoid a convincing type of statement. We really want to ask open-ended questions when we're speaking with someone who's dealing with suicide. We really want to allow them to drive the conversation. We want to allow them to talk, to give us as much information as we can, because our most effective way of intervening with someone that's dealing with suicide is for them to make the admission that they still have life or light left in them. And what I mean is that our goal is to ask them open-ended questions, to gather information until they state something that is a positive in their life, something that they like, something that they look forward to. And what we're doing there is we're using that almost like a hook, where if they give us any sign of life, anything that they like doing, anything that they look forward to, anything that they miss, we take that statement and we can use that as a hook to connect them back to life, to say, I know what you're going through is tough and it's hard and it's challenging, but it sounds like if something happened to you, you'd really miss your dog. Or it sounds like your niece or your nephew is really, really important to you. Or it sounds like you'd really miss playing basketball or football with your friends. So knowing that these things sound important to you, how do you feel about putting a plan in place with me to keep you safe for now? So our goal is to ask open-ended questions, to gather information, to allow them to tell us what their life point is. And if they give that to us, by all means, you grab it with both hands and you try to use that to connect them back to life. And there are times where we think that we might hear what we call a hook with them, and the person may dismiss it and say, no, I wouldn't really miss that much. I'd be fine without that. And that's okay. It's no different than fishing. You put the hook back out in the water and you continue to fish. You continue to ask open-ended questions, to gather information, to be able to grab the next opportunity where we feel like they might be showing a life point, to connect them back to life. And again, once we've connected them back to life, our goal is to discuss a plan with them to keep them safe for now. To ask them questions like, do you have lethal means at your disposal right now? Do you have a plan You know, how realistic is their plan? What can we do to keep you safe and away from the plan? If someone has a bottle of prescription medication, it's okay to take that from them for the night, or if they have a firearm or another lethal weapon, we can put other plans in place to be able to get that out of their possession if they'll allow us to do that, to increase our opportunity to keep them safe for now. So moving to, if you do not feel comfortable discussing the topic of suicide with someone, that's perfectly okay. What's really important to someone is that while you might not feel comfortable discussing it, that you're willing to be there with them through the process, that you care about them enough to have the conversation with them. So if you're confronted with someone who you think is potentially suicidal and you don't feel comfortable having the conversation, the first step that I instruct people to do is to evaluate the need for emergency personnel. Have they done something yet? Have they taken an action yet? Have they ingested something yet that is going to put them at risk in the immediate? So that's the first thing you want to do, because depending on where you come into the situation, someone may have already done something that, if you're in the process of evaluating them and we haven't evaluated the need for emergency personnel, unfortunately a situation could end before we want it to. So, you know, when you're involved in these situations, do everything you can do to try to figure out, is there a need right now for emergency personnel? And if there is, you know, immediately contact 911 or another emergency personnel to get help en route ASAP. You want to provide the person with local or national, you know, suicide or crisis hotline resources. You know, not only just providing them with the resource, but saying, hey, like, if you're comfortable with it, or if you want me to, you know, I'll dial the number for you, or I'll sit here with you, and I'll be here with you through the conversation, just to be a measure of support with you. And hopefully through those interactions, the person who's speaking with or working with the person that you're confronted with will put a safety plan for now in place with them. And then essentially your goal at that point is to review the plan with them, to follow up with them, to make sure that they understand the plan. And then to be that further and continual point of following up with them to make sure that they're safe for now, and that they haven't gained access to other means of potentially harming themselves. I just wanted to make a few resources available to those who might want resources either on a national level or in a county that you may reside in or work in. If you're looking for other resources, please don't hesitate to contact John or I, as we, you know, we'll be happy to assist you. And I will open the forum for, you know, questions or thoughts or concerns. But before I do, I would love for us to do the exercise one more time together, to continue to build your confidence and comfortability with asking the question, are you thinking about suicide? So again, I will be quiet for a few seconds and to allow you guys to ask the question aloud.
Thanks very much, Alex. That was a really helpful information, and I hope people have learned something new, some different tips that they can take with them to maybe start the conversation with someone that you know or love, and you know, help them through these difficult situations that they might be facing. The floor is open for questions. Feel free to use the Q&A section to ask your questions, and we'll tackle those as they come up. Alex, you must have given all kinds of great information. So far, there's no questions. Answered a lot of
I,
questions there.
I do want to thank everybody for taking the time this afternoon to spend it with us. I know, again, it's a very difficult and challenging topic to discuss, but I really appreciate everyone's willingness and courage and strength and being here today to discuss a very difficult topic, and then to participate in an exercise in which it is. I hope everyone shared the same sentiment that I did, that it is a little more challenging to ask the question aloud when you're faced with doing that. Again, I do want to apologize to everyone. We're still working out the kinks, if you will, on the PowerPoint presentation. So I'm sorry you were able to see the slides or the next note. So hopefully sooner rather than later, we'll get all that worked out. But if there are no questions at this time, I want to make myself a resource to you, to anyone in your community, anyone at your agency. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, there are obviously, larger presentations that we can make available to you and your work group, whether they be QPR related or assist training related. But again, this was kind of a down and dirty, an hour session to get, to continue to put more tools in our tool belts relating to suicide. So I really appreciate everyone's time today.
We did get one question here for you, Alex. Well, first of all, there was somebody who had a question about they had read an article about the difference between wanting to die and being suicidal. Can you elaborate a little bit between that kind of differentiation?
Wanting to die and then being suicidal?
Yes.
I think, I mean, it's a really good question. I think both of those things are something that happens in the river or the path to suicide, if you will. That's why I make sure to kind of highlight that in the presentation, in the sense that wanting to die or having thoughts of suicide, these are all things that happen to us or happen to people in the river of suicide. The river of suicide is not the same for everyone, but typically people who are having thoughts of suicide or do suicide or are considering dying, in one way or another, they are making their way through that river, if you will. So I think, I do believe in aspects of that article, but ultimately I relate it all back to the river and where that person is at in the river when we find them, and what we can do to get them access to what they need to help them.
Great, thank you. Another attendee asked the question, can you differentiate a bit more between behaviors to take if you feel comfortable or uncomfortable? What should you say to the person if you are comfortable? And what do you do if not?
Well, I mean, feeling comfortable or not feeling comfortable, again, I want to reiterate that there is no right or wrong answer there. No, one intervention is not better than the other. It's all just about your general comfortability level. If you feel comfortable with having the conversation with someone about their suicidality, we discuss things like, not making judgmental statements and avoiding convincing them, asking open-ended questions. Our goal when we delve into that conversation with them, we want to ask questions or have conversations with them in an effort for that person to try to explain or state something to us that is a positive in their life. Something that they look forward to, something that they would miss. And our goal is whenever they make a statement like that, we want to grab it and we want to try to connect them back to life by saying something like, it sounds like you'd really miss your dog. It sounds like you'd really miss your wife. If you did something to yourself that you might harm yourself, you never would see them again. It sounds like you'd miss them if something happened to you. So how do you feel about putting a plan in place with me to try to keep you safe for now? I'm not asking you to never think about suicide again, but I want to keep you safe for now. Our goal is to try to find something, a life point, a positive, and connect them back to life. And sometimes in these conversations, it's really difficult to get that out of someone. So what I like to tell people is them having hesitation or them saying, I don't know. Sometimes an I don't know can be a hook because they're still here with us right now. So let's utilize an I don't know. Let's utilize a I'm not quite sure. I don't know what my plan is. And let's grab that and bring them back to life. So there are plenty of times I've been in suicide interventions with folks, and they can't find their own hook, if you will. They can't find their own light, but they also don't know either. They're also still with us. So our goal is to allow them to drive the conversation, and we're fishing at that point. And anytime we feel like we have a hook or we get a bite or we see a positive, let's link that back to trying to keep them safe for now so that they can enjoy the thing that they stated that they still do enjoy.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, with no additional questions, I guess we will wrap things up. I want to thank everybody again for taking time to attend today. We hope the information presented has given you something to use as you walk through life, and if you encounter these situations, to offer some help and guidance to those you love. So Alex, thank you very much. And if other people have questions, feel free to email me or email Alex. We will get in touch with you, relay those questions as well to Alex if I get them, and we'll get an answer right away for you. In the meantime, thanks very much. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.